Hello everyone, I'm Justin and this is a full recap of Orphan released in 2009. Real quick, if you're watching this video and you haven't yet subscribed, make sure to click that subscribe button and click the bell to know anytime we upload a new video. Although Orphan nearly quadrupled its $20 million budget at the box office, grossing $78 million worldwide over its 3-month 2009 theatrical release, it hadn't immediately warranted a sequel. But now, a little over 13 years later, Paramount looks to release a prequel to the film titled Orphan First Kill, releasing August 19th in select theaters and on Paramount+. So we thought now would be the perfect time to go back and break down everything that happened in one of the many forgotten 2000s horror movies. I personally found Orphan to be very enjoyable, and I think it definitely deserves more attention than it's gotten over the years. So if you haven't seen it already, make sure to check it out first before continuing with our explanation and recap of it. The movie opens on a pregnant Kate Coleman and her husband John entering a hospital to be taken to a delivery room so she can give birth to their soon-to-be daughter Jessica. But as Kate's being wheeled down the hallway, she begins heavily bleeding, and once they get her to a hospital bed, they inform her that her child has died, although Kate refuses to believe so since she can feel it kicking. Still, she's forced to go through a brutal childbirth, only to be handed a screaming, blood-covered baby before jolting awake, revealing it all to have just been a nightmare. She did recently go through a stillbirth in her real life though, leading her and John to decide on adopting a child, as we learn during her meeting with her therapist, Dr. Browning, during which we also learn of Kate's previous troubles as an alcoholic. She's managed to fight the urge for a while now, but she still doesn't feel ready to allow another child into her life. But Browning puts faith in her, saying she believes she is. After her session, Kate heads to her daughter Max's school for the deaf or hearing impaired to pick her up, and when they get home, we're also introduced to her son, Daniel. That night, Kate continues to express her hesitance with adopting a new child to John, but ultimately, she decides she wants to go through with it, with the intention of giving the love they had for Jessica to someone who really needs it. So they head to St. Mariana's Orphanage for Girls, where they're greeted by Sister Abigail, who helps Kate look around while John heads to the bathroom. As he's making his way back from the bathroom, though, he hears the sound of a young girl singing, and follows it to find a child named Esther, and he takes an immediate interest in her, with her displaying impressive knowledge and talent, specifically as an artist. And Kate also takes a liking to her, so they discuss adopting her with Sister Abigail in her office. We learn that Esther was originally from Russia, but made her way to America with her previous family until they died in a house fire, with her being the sole survivor. Although she's been through a lot, Abigail claims they've had no trouble with her, describing her as almost like a princess, with her always wearing ribbons around her wrists and neck, and she believes the three of them have really formed a connection. So Kate and John go through with adopting her, and take her home a couple days later, where she's introduced to the rest of the family, making a good impression on Max and John's mom, Grandma Barbara, although Daniel doesn't seem to be a fan of her. His dislike of her grows more later while they're giving her welcoming gifts, and aren't giving him any attention. So he heads over to his treehouse with his friends to look at naked girls in magazines. While he's doing that, Esther heads out to play in the snow with Max, prompting a conversation between Kate and her mother-in-law about something that went down near the pond involving Max while Kate was still heavily drinking. That night, Kate and John start having some fun in the bedroom, but their pleasure is quickly interrupted by Esther, who spookily wakes up Max so she can join her in sleeping in their parents' room, with her specifically asking to sleep next to John, claiming to be afraid of the thunder outside. The next day, Esther gets ready for her first day of school in an old-fashioned dress, which Daniel and Max chuckle at upon seeing it, and Kate suggests she wears something else, but Esther reiterates a quote Kate had told her during their first meeting, saying there's nothing wrong with being different. So Kate gives in and takes the kids to school, where Esther's immediately a target of bullying from a young girl named Brenda. After school, Esther and Max again go out to play in the snow, but this time the two end up playing on top of the frozen pond, which causes Kate to freak out and force them away from it. So they head off into the nearby woods, where Daniel had been practicing shooting some paintballs with his paintball gun, at first shooting at some toys and bullseye targets, until for some reason deciding to shoot at a bird when it lands on the target, which is seen by Esther. He claims he didn't think it would actually hurt it, but she says he'll now have to put it out of its misery. He refuses to do so though, so Esther takes care of it herself and smashes it with a rock, which completely freaks him out. Later that night, while Esther's taking a bath, Kate heads in her room to put away some laundry, but while doing so, she notices one of her drawers are stuck, and when she eventually gets it loose, she finds a book containing a photo of an unknown man. While pulling out the photo, she accidentally drops the book, prompting Esther's singing from the bathroom to stop for a moment before starting back up again. Her killing of the bird earlier has added even more fuel to Daniel's dislike of her, and he begins taking part in bullying her at school, throwing her books on the floor. On top of this, she still continues to be bullied by Brenda, with her making fun of Esther for carrying a Bible around with her at school, and refusing to give it back to her, ultimately leading to all the pages being flown through the air and onto the floor. While Esther's picking them up, Brenda attempts to grab her by the ribbon around her neck, so Esther lets out an ear-piercing scream in retaliation. Kate tries to talk with her after school about what happened while teaching her how to play piano, but Esther doesn't have anything to say about it, so Kate tries to cheer her up with her family scrapbook that she'd recently added a photo of Esther into, but although it does seem to cheer her up a bit, it prompts Esther to ask who's Jessica, claiming Max had talked about her. So Kate shows her Jessica's dedication garden filled with white roses grown over the scattered ashes of their lost daughter, believing a part of her is still alive as long as the flowers grow. A teary-eyed Esther compliments Kate, claiming Jessica would have been lucky to have such a great mother. That night, Kate talks to John about her growing connection with Esther, before one thing leads to another and the two start getting it on in the middle of the kitchen. But their fun time is interrupted once again when Esther walks by as they're doing it. Kate tries talking about it with her the next morning, but Esther shows to already have knowledge on sex, which worries Kate enough to suggest taking her to Dr. Browning in hopes of learning more more about her, but John doesn't think they need to worry about one dirty word. Speaking of John, we see him later take Max and Esther to the park, where he's approached by the Coleman's next door neighbor, Joyce Patterson, who tries to start flirting with him, but he politely shuts her down. Esther listens in on their conversation at first, but gets distracted by Brenda, who also happens to be playing at the park. Brenda notices Esther's there as well, and turns to look at her a couple times, but at some point Esther's no longer anywhere to be seen, until she suddenly appears behind her at the top of the slide and shoves her to the ground, breaking her leg. Kate and John confront her about this, but Esther claims they were just playing, and Max, who started to sort of look up to Esther, backs up her claim, saying Brenda just slipped. So they go ahead with their dinner, during which Daniel calls out Esther for not eating like a normal person and calls her a freak. John tells him to apologize to his sister, but Daniel emphatically states,
"She's not my fucking sister."
As punishment for Daniel's behavior, John locks the treehouse, saying he'll get the key back when he apologizes. While grocery shopping later with Max and Esther, Kate gets a call from Sister Abigail, in which Kate informs her of what went down with her and Brenda. And later, Kate becomes more concerned with Esther's behavior when she finds her playing the piano, even though she had originally made it as if she didn't know how to play. But when she brings this up to John, he doesn't seem to be worried about it at all, believing she was just trying to spend time with her. Their argument eventually shifts to his interaction with Joyce Patterson earlier, that Esther had apparently told Kate about and described in a way that made it seem like John was hitting on her. And it's revealed that John had actually cheated on Kate about 10 years ago, so Kate's suspicious as to why he didn't tell her about their interaction. This then prompts John to bring up the incident briefly spoken about earlier, where her drinking put Max's life in danger. The argument continues to escalate from there, but seemingly to the delightment of Esther, whose smile grows throughout. The next morning, Sister Abigail arrives at their home to talk about Esther, who after looking more into her past, she thinks may be a problem. She recalls an incident that happened at her old school, in which a boy had fallen and stabbed himself with a pair of scissors, as well as the house fire her previous family had died in, which the police deduced to be arson, although they've never found the person who did it. John's shocked she'd even suggest Esther's capable of doing things like this, but Kate appears to share her concerns, and so they agree on taking her to Dr. Browning. Esther had been listening in on their conversation though, so she recruits Max to help her stop Sister Abigail from taking her away. Her plan involves collecting the treehouse keys and a hammer before heading out and shoving Max into the street in front of Abigail's car as she's driving off, causing her to swerve and stop her car to check on her. But as she does, Esther appears behind her and hits her in the face with the hammer, bludgeoning her to death as she attempts to crawl away. They then take any evidence of her murder into the treehouse and hide it in the floor, and Esther frightens Max into staying quiet about it. Daniel, who'd been out playing in the snow, ends up seeing them as they make their way out of the treehouse. So that night, Esther holds a knife against his throat and forces him to tell her what he saw, but he claims he didn't see anything other than them leaving the treehouse. Still, she threatens to cut his balls off if he tells anyone about it. Esther's then taken to Dr. Browning the next day, but whatever she says during their meeting convinces Browning that Kate's bad parenting is the cause of Esther's behavior. Kate's completely confused by this notion, but John feels that a lot of what she's saying makes sense. Once they get back home, Kate gets a call from the orphanage, with the caller asking if she's aware as to why Sister Abigail hadn't yet returned. And later, the cops end up finding Abigail's body, although they don't have any leads or suspects. This leads Kate to do some research of her own and contact the orphanage in hopes of learning more of the Russian orphanage Esther came from. But she's shocked to learn that said Russian orphanage has no record of her being there, although they say they'll continue to look into it. John still isn't worried about Esther though, and actually spends the next morning drawing with her and talking about her strained relationship with Kate, who she believes doesn't like her very much. But John assures her that she loves her just as much as Max and Daniel, and suggests she does something to show her mom how much she loves her. So later that night, Esther approaches Kate, claiming she has a special surprise for her, and that surprise turns out to be a bouquet of white roses, picked from Jessica's dedication garden. Kate's immediately overcome with emotion and grabs Esther by the arm, claiming she knew what those flowers meant to her. But Esther eventually breaks free of her grasp and runs off. Kate heads back out to Jessica's now destroyed memorial, and while she's distracted with that, Esther sneaks into their tool shed and finds a vise, into which she puts her arm and continues tightening until it breaks. So when John eventually tends to her in her room, it appears that Kate had broken her arm, so he asks her to sleep on the couch while he and Esther sleep in their room. This emotional torment nearly proves to be Kate's breaking point when she heads out and buys a couple bottles of wine, but she ultimately decides against drinking any of it and dumps the entirety of one of the bottles in the sink. The next morning though, things continue to get worse for Kate, when while dropping the kids off at school, she notices all of Daniel's books have fallen out of the bottom of his bag, so she goes to help him pick them up, but while she's distracted, Esther takes her car out of park and puts it in reverse with Max still inside. So the car begins rolling backwards down the street and eventually crashes into a big pile of snow, luckily without injuring Max, and this incident causes a confrontation between her, John, and Dr. Browning, during which they also bring up the wine bottle found and given to them by Esther, and suggest for her to go to rehab, but she contends that she still hasn't had a drink in almost a year. John can't find any reason to believe her though, and gives her a week to enter rehab or he's leaving with the kids. But Kate's not going to leave the kids around Esther any longer, so she attempts to leave with them that night. But when she goes to collect Max, she's met in her room by Esther, who completely drops her facade. Kate says she won't allow her to hurt her kids, but Esther claims if anyone's known for putting them in danger, it's Kate, recalling the pond incident as well as the dead child she had to carry in her stomach, both of which she'd learned in detail from Kate's journal. Kate's unable to retaliate since she has nothing concrete to prove of Esther's true intentions, so she sneaks into her room the next day and finds the Bible she'd found earlier, inside of which she now also finds the logo to Sarn Institute. She calls them up, believing it to be the actual Russian orphanage Esther was first adopted from, but is shocked to learn that it isn't an orphanage, but an Estonian mental institution. Daniel, meanwhile, has finally built up the courage to do something about Esther, and convinces Max to tell him of Esther's wrongdoings, who then shows him drawings of what happened to Sister Abigail and tells him the evidence is in the treehouse. He makes plans of collecting the evidence, but little did he know Esther had been listening in on their conversation. So when he heads in there the next day, she follows behind him and traps him inside before lighting the entire treehouse on fire, as well as the evidence. He manages to make it out the window and to the top of the treehouse, but eventually falls back first to the ground below. Esther then goes to kill him with a rock, just as she did to the bird earlier, but she's stopped by Max, who shoves her to the ground just before Kate becomes aware of what's happened and rushes to Daniel's aid. They take him to the hospital, where they learn he's luckily only suffered a serious neck injury, and while there, Kate tries explaining everything she's learned to John, but he still doesn't believe for any of it to mean anything and continues pointing blame on Kate. So she makes him a deal, claiming she'll leave as long as Esther goes too. Esther, meanwhile, convinces Grandma Barbara to lend her $1 for the vending machine, which in turn gives her the opportunity to head into Daniel's room, in which she begins suffocating him with a pillow. Max eventually realizes what she's gone to do and tries to get her parents' attention, but it appears they're too late, with him flatlining by the time they get there. Luckily though, he's only gone into cardiac arrest, and the doctors manage to find a pulse. But Kate still can't hold her emotions together, and finally slaps Esther across the face. Her outburst forces doctors to sedate her though, and when she wakes later, she's met by John, who informs her that Daniel's gonna be okay and will return home in a few days, so he'll be taking the kids home for the night, including Esther, although Kate pleads for him not to. When they get home, John tucks Max into bed, and as they're saying goodnight, Esther enters the room, seemingly to say goodnight to her sister as well. But unbeknownst to either of them, she covertly grabs Max's hearing aid as she leaves. John then heads downstairs and knocks back a few glasses of wine, until he's eventually approached by Esther, who's gotten all dressed up for the occasion. John's very confused by Esther's attire, but he's too drunk to really think much of it. But after the two exchange I love yous, Esther begins making moves on him, prompting him to jolt awake and question what she's doing. He explains that although he loves her, it's not in the way she thinks, before openly sobbing over Daniel and how he feels that everything's falling apart. So Esther comforts him, claiming he's a great father and husband, as well as being a handsome man. This completely freaks John out, and he yells for her to go to her room and claims that he can't deal with any of this anymore. So she storms into her room, and while she cries into her pillow, we cut back to Kate in the hospital, waking up to a phone call from Dr. Varva from the Sarn Institute, who reveals that Esther was a former patient of theirs, before also revealing that although Esther appears to be a child, she's actually a 33-year-old woman named Lena Clammer, who suffers from a rare disorder called hypopituitarism, which causes dwarfism. She had apparently killed 7 people that they know of, and was one of their most violent patients, forcing them to put her in a straitjacket that she would constantly try to fight out of, leaving scars on her neck and wrists. Amongst the 7 people she'd killed was a family in Estonia that she tricked into adopting her, just as she did with the Colemans, and killed after being unable to seduce the father. Upon learning all of this, Kate immediately rushes back home, calling the cops on her way there, but we see Esther's already taken off the ribbons on her wrists and neck, as well as her fake teeth and makeup. John heads up to her room to apologize for yelling at her, but she's nowhere to be found, and instead he finds her explicit paintings of violence and sex all along the walls, which were hidden in normal light but are viewable in blue light. When he gets back downstairs, the house's electricity is suddenly shut off, before he's attacked from the shadows by Esther, who repeatedly stabs him to death before turning her attention to Max, who'd witnessed the whole thing from the top of the stairs. As Max runs into a nearby closet, Kate finally arrives home, crashing through the side of the house before finding John's lifeless body on the floor. She then rushes upstairs in search of Max, but as she's looking, she's shot through a window by Esther, who had grabbed a gun from their safe. She then hunts Kate down, looking to finish the job, but Kate manages to evade her by leaving through a window onto the glass ceiling of their greenhouse, inside of which Kate sees Max had also made her way to. Esther begins entering the greenhouse as well, so Kate draws her attention back to her so Max can escape, before falling through the ceiling and landing on top of Esther, incapacitating her for a moment. Kate then grabs her gun and exits the greenhouse with Max, and out in the distance we can see and hear cop cars, but just when they think they're in the clear, Esther appears once again and knocks Kate back onto the frozen pond. She slashes at her a few times with a knife and looks to be on the verge of killing her, but her attempt is thwarted by Max, who managed to get hold of and fire the gun, unfortunately only hitting the frozen pond beneath them though, which causes the ice to crack and for them to fall underwater. Esther still manages to grab hold of Kate, but Kate's able to get away with a stiff elbow to the face. It's still not enough to keep her down though, and she grabs hold of Kate's leg, but Kate's able to put her down for good with another stiff shot, this time being a kick to the face that looks to have broken her neck. And as Esther floats to the bottom of the pond, Kate and Max are finally able to reach the police and make their escape. And that was our explanation and recap of Orphan. If you enjoyed the video or found it to be helpful in any way, then make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. And let us know in the comments what you thought of the original Orphan film. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll talk to you again soon.